for having me here. I'm really excited to host this panel. This is a question that I think about a lot, and I have turned to some of these people on the panel for their insight on this, and I'm excited that they're going to share some of that with all of you. Residential development in the last decade has really focused on several big cities in the Bay Area. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? We know that some cities are really resistant to housing of any kind. We know that there's been a real contraction in the construction industry since the housing crash of 2008. And a lot of investment, corporate ownership, a rise of corporate ownership in single family housing and as well as high-end luxury apartment building. And we also know that we really want to meet our climate goals in California. We want to develop in a way that's sustainable for the environment. But we also want to think about how to develop in suburbs and provide infill housing that offers a less expensive construction types, that thinks about how to develop in a sustainable way, and that most importantly centers equity. And so here with me to think about these really important questions are Supervisor Myrna Melgar. She was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in this November. And she's an urban planner and an economic development and housing policy expert. And she served in city government in a number of different capacities and also speaks several languages. So welcome, Supervisor Melgar. We also have Supervisor Gordon Marr, who prior to his election on the Board of Supervisors served as the Executive Director of the Chinese Progressive Association and Jobs with Justice in San Francisco. Welcome, Supervisor Marr. We have Debra Ballinger. She's the Executive Director of Monument Impact, who over the course of her career has worked on immigration rights, affordable housing, trying to get jobs with livable wages, and other campaigns that were really rooted in community organizing. And then we have Shajuti Hossain, who is a staff attorney at Public Advocates, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization that is really looking at the systemic causes of poverty and racial discrimination in the Bay Area. So welcome, Shajuti. And last but not least, we have Poncho Guevara, who is the Executive Director of the Sacred Heart Community Service. And that's a grassroots anti-poverty organization that's based in San Jose, which incorporates an array of human services, mutual support initiatives, and direct action organizing. So welcome, Poncho. I wanted to start with a question for all of the panelists, and I'm hoping we can do this in sort of a round robin. You can just go around and answer. But why do we need to rethink the suburbs? And I'll start with you, Shajuti.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for having me. I'm very honored to be here on this panel with you. So why we need to rethink the suburbs? Well, first, let's think about the Bay Area. It's diverse, it's innovative and beautiful, and these are some of the things that make our region great. But unfortunately, a lot of us can't enjoy those qualities because the Bay Area is now more racially segregated today than it was in 1970. And that's because many of our suburbs have actually perpetuated racial segregation over time by denying housing that would be accessible to lower income families who are disproportionately Black and Latinx. I've been reflecting recently about how this is not just a Bay Area problem or a California problem or even just an America problem. These systems of oppression connect all of us, even to the 1,000+ Palestinians who are facing eviction in Jerusalem right now for simply living in the homes their families have lived in for generations. What I'm reading about there is different, but eerily familiar to the disinvestment and displacement that lower income communities of color here in the Bay Area are facing. I appreciate you all for allowing me to take a moment to share this reflection, and I invite all of us to commit ourselves against all forms of oppression because our own liberation depends on each other's. Looking back here in our backyards, segregation in the Bay Area has led to many disturbing problems. One is that it allows governments to hoard more public resources like parks and schools in wealthier and whiter communities while underinvesting in lower income communities of color. And that's a regional issue because if suburban cities are denying affordable housing, then they become predominantly affluent and disproportionately white, while the urban cities become predominantly lower income and disproportionately Black and Latinx. We saw this a lot over the last several decades, but now we're seeing more affluent white residents actually coming back to the urban cities, meanwhile displacing Black and Latinx families who have built communities and families here. So right now, the Bay Area actually has a great opportunity to rethink the suburbs, because new California laws are requiring our regional and local governments to affirmatively further for housing, which basically means to actively undo racial segregation. These laws require our regional plans and our local plans to undo segregation. And to truly work, they have to work together by addressing racial segregation explicitly and incorporating the following two components. One is to invest in more resources in lower income neighborhoods of color that existing residents need to stay and thrive there if they choose. And second, to increase affordable housing options in places that have historically excluded them so that lower income families can move there if they choose. And both of these two solutions are needed to make sure that people who've been marginalized have fair housing choices and equal access to the resources we all need.
Thank you, Shajuti. I appreciate that. Debra, I'm going to toss that same question to you. Oh, and you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Monument is based in Concord, in the Monument Corridor, which is the most densely populated area of Concord for sure, but it's predominantly Latinx, and there's more Afghan refugees. These are the populations we serve, although because of displacement, many have been displaced to East Contra Costa. So our services now also are focused on residents in East Contra Costa. But I thought, actually, for those of you who don't know Concord, and as a transplant from San Francisco in Supervisor Melgar's district to Concord, it took me a while to kind of really see how amazingly racially segregated Contra Costa is in general, and Concord, being the largest city in Contra Costa, and one of the largest in the Bay Area, really sees this population of close to 40,000 jammed into 1/3 of the area of the entire city of Concord. There's a lack of political will in the suburbs, especially in Contra Costa, to break up exclusionary zoning, pass tenant protections to stem the displacement of low-income residents of color, or invest in affordable housing. And this has only exacerbated segregation and the housing crisis. That crisis has gotten even worse since the pandemic. Just a little bit more context, there's actually 66,000 undocumented immigrants in Contra Costa, and most are tenants. The overall county poverty rate is about 9%, but compared to Concord, which is nearly 11%, Bay Point 19%, Antioch at 14%, we are continuing to see the reality that job growth is really only in low-wage jobs. Black and Latinx workers earn less than their white counterparts, regardless of their level of education. Latinx workers earn half of what white workers earn. So when we look at racial inequity and resegregation, we have to take into account that more than half of Black and Latinx workers, especially women, are both rent burdened and economically insecure. Economic recovery is going to depend on stable housing, more affordable housing, and folks getting back into the workforce in jobs that actually pay an equitable wage.
Thanks, Debra. Poncho, I'm going to turn to you now.
Thanks, Erin. I think the question of why do we need to rethink the suburbs is actually pretty simple. It's because we, as a community, as an economy, we need to be able to, we're faced with these terrible situation of a legacy of discrimination that Shajuti was able to kind of articulate in terms of these systems that actually create this the segregation, and then the pressure of our economy pushing us to say, well, we need to create more housing. We need to make sure that that's happening in a way. And the truth is, people just seem to want to have all the amenities and they want to have the housing, but they don't want the people that are required to provide these resources and services. And those things that happen in our cities, where you've seen diversity of folks living in some of our larger urban settings, is now putting that pressure on suburbs. So suburbs need to change. We need to grow. But since we don't want the people, and we don't really want the transportation, costs and other things that are affiliated with bringing people in. We need to be able to think about how do we reimagine what kind of communities that we want to live in. We need to increasing density and doing some other things are important kind of components, but people don't want to live in those kind of environments. So if people don't want to live in a semi-rural environment, and want to have the amenities, but want to have people living here, I mean, we have to think differently about how our spaces are created and how are we creating these welcoming environments. So Debra was talking about Contra Costa, Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley. I mean, obviously a huge number of jobs that are being created, a huge pressure for those, but the economic diversity that we need in order to grow and thrive is coming into clash with the legacy, historic redlining and racist policies that are pushing people out. And we don't want to put pressures and use other tools and solutions to make sure that we're inclusive in our society. So these things are just coming into a clash. We need to have honest conversations about who and what we want and what are the implications of policy tools that are at our disposal. And that's the exciting thing that we're going to be talking about a little bit later, about what are some of the tools, what are the things that the state has actually put in place to be more affirmative at dealing with this legacy of historic racism, to make sure that we're actually building communities and economies that actually work for everyone.
Thank you, Poncho. Supervisor Melgar.
Thank you, Erin. So I will not talk about race because Shajuti and Poncho and Debra already touched on it, and Shajuti, your points were like right on. I think that what I'm going to talk about is climate change and sustainability, because the patterns that everyone has talked about that were designed to exclude and also convey asset building benefits on some and not others, also exacerbated what we do to the land and our dependence on carbon burning fuels. And we have in San Francisco sort of exported our working class to a large extent, and people drive back or bar back into service jobs. And on the long run, that is just not sustainable. And what we have also is that in the sort of, in my district, which is a suburban district, like Supervisor Marr's district too, there definitely is a change, a generational change of how folks want to live. And that is also attached to car dependence, slow streets, access to public transportation, a whole host of things. And, I think that just in terms of your question of rethinking the suburbs, why we need to do that, I think that the expectation of this generation and younger generations is just different. In terms of like what we're doing to the earth, what we're doing in depending on a car-centric, less dense, environment, and our relationship to job centers, our responsibility to our population and sustainability. So while I don't have all the answers, I can tell you that people are thinking that we need to rethink it for a whole host of reasons. But number one, it's because we may be underwater in the next generation, and what can we do to use the land more sustainably and more strategically?
Thank you. And last but not least, Supervisor Marr, why do we need to rethink the suburbs?
Wow. Well, just maybe to not repeat and all the really great points that have already been made, I would just sort of add that obviously we're in an extreme housing affordability and displacement and gentrification crisis, and we're seeing increased racial and economic segregation in the region and in our cities to our core urban areas. So it's absolutely critical that right now that we look at rethink and reshape our suburbs to address these great challenges that we're facing in our cities and in our region. I would say also that there's differences in the suburbs too, right? There's the suburbs that are high resource and exclusionary, racially and economically exclusionary, in our region. But then there's also suburbs that are growing that are working class people of color predominantly too. So I think we have to sort of understand and sort of plan around those differences. And then we could even see that in our city, in San Francisco. Again, as Supervisor Melgar said, we both represent districts that are essentially suburbs within San Francisco, primarily single family homes, pretty, at this point, expensive and exclusionary. Although I would say my district, the Sunset District in San Francisco, it's actually more of a historically working class neighborhood, working class families. And over the last several decades, primarily Chinese and other Asian working class families that have settled in the Sunset. And before that, it was Irish and European working class families. And my district is, majority Asian American and 70% people of color. But now in 2021, it's extremely, the cost of housing has been driven up so high that, the average house, their median price of a house now goes for $1.4 million. The rents at one of the new apartment buildings that was just built and they're starting to rent out right now out on Noriega and 43rd Avenue, is $4,000 to $5,500 a month for 2 to 3 bedroom units. So, so this is why we need to rethink, the suburbs in San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Supervisor. I appreciate all the panelists' great insight into all this. I see some people are already starting to write questions into the chat. I forgot to mention that earlier, so please, we want to hear your questions and we will get to them at the end. So feel free to drop those in at any time. We'll be kind of collating them and looking at them as we go. Poncho, you mentioned the tools that we might need to begin to rethink the suburbs. And so I wanted to turn to you and ask about those. What are the tools at our disposal that you see that we should be using right now?
Thank you. I think one of the biggest tools that we have that has been actually given to us more recently is basically the regional housing needs assessment, which has actually been done very differently or developed in a different way by the legislature. And so instead of just looking at how we've what we're doing moving forward in terms of building affordable housing and meeting our housing needs, not just affordable, but all sorts of housing needs, it's actually saying, well, what are we going to do to correct for what the backlog that we've had in the past? And I think that's really, really important for us to be able to look at that. But I think the most important thing when it comes to tools, and this question is really asking about at a regional scale, it's not just about having these tools and having these laws, but really the biggest problem that we have, the biggest tool that we need is political leadership. And having political leaders that actually give a damn about saying we are going to actually do something about the problem, the holes that we have, and being able to work collectively to be able to say we are all sharing in the collective responsibility, whether it's the tools that exist at a policy level, but really it's about how are we creating that base of vision and support and grassroots and being able to do that primarily through grassroots organizing, of actually setting the context, being honest about the questions that are facing us and about how we are all need each other. We need to be able to build a multiracial and inclusive community that includes not only race, but also class in terms of where people contribute in our economy, and that there's not a neighborhood where those people need to be there and our folks need to be here. We all need to be here united together if we're going to be able to function together. And that sense of collective liberation, that sense of collective ownership and our fates being tied together, that needs to be the mantra for political leadership. And I think really the best tool that we have is, are we organizing together? Are we organizing, investing in grassroots organizing, investing in setting a context about what is just in our community, in our society, and moving together to actually make sure that elected leaders, some of them have the courage and some of them have a hard time actually standing up to opposition because people have these native racist fears that exist within them, and it's really easy to turn the tide on that. I just had an example of this recently where a few years ago, there were some folks that were there was a development, a senior assisted living facility that had gone out of business, and it was acquired by by supportive housing, folks that were working to try to create housing for the homeless in a wealthy neighborhood in San Jose. And they had been working for a while to assemble the financing and making sure that we're able to make this happen for folks. And they had communicated with the elected leaders and said, hey, is this an issue? And they said, no, we understand, what it is. But I'm not going to come out forward on it. And now it's been coming through the entitlement process, and they're saying, and at least a couple of the elected leaders that were contacted in community meetings withered under pressure just like that. And now I'm saying like, well, we need to wait longer, and we're going to do some other kinds of things. And, the idea that we can just have people with money and resources or developers or others kind of work the channels and do these other things, and then ultimately utilizing some legislative tools at our disposal to be able to try to get something forward didn't work. And you have neighborhood opposition coming in there because they're afraid of the other. That is a failure of political leadership. And it says something about the fact that we need to be on the ground, talking to people about the nature of the problem that we have, talking about the nature of the solutions that are required to address issues around homelessness or affordable housing, and being able to communicate effectively with with all of our neighborhoods and all of our communities around, if it's not just about helping someone else, it's like, do you want your kids to be able to live here? Do you want other families? Do you want the people that teach your kids or take care of our parents or take care of our children to be part of the fabric of our community? That is something we have to be, we need to be assertive around. And we also have to call out and call people into a conversation about what are we doing to address the growing segregation. And COVID has only made that situation that much more urgent.
You mentioned needing to speak with the collective voice. Are you seeing a growing cohesion amongst folks who are striving to break down those racial barriers and develop in an equitable way amongst those community organizations? And if not, why not?
I think you are having at least a little bit more of I think I'll be honest with you, Erin, I think that it's mixed. But I think what's happened is that COVID in particular has actually shown a very, very stark spotlight on just how deep these racialized divisions happen in our society. The difference in terms of how communities have been impacted by the pandemic, economically, both in terms of health, literally people dying because of their membership in a particular group. And the disproportionality that you're actually seeing is getting people to actually listen to is like, oh, these are actual conversations that we need to be having about who is more disproportionately impacted, and that a lot of those divisions happen around race. And so I think what's happening, at least here in Santa Clara County, is that we're developing a coalition of organizations who have heretofore been on the sidelines. They've been working on different types of issues and in their particular silos, and saying, actually, this is about race. This is about racial equity. This is about racial justice. And we need to be walking and talking into one voice. So if you're working on if you're working on environmental issues or working on educational equity issues and other things, these divisions are very pronounced. So if we are going to be able to look at our collective change and liberation, we need to be really having difficult conversations with all of our constituencies about how these issues impact folks, especially Black, brown, and indigenous communities and people of color in general, but being able to look at the disproportionality in there and being able to break down some of those conversations, divisions, and center the voices of people that are most impacted. And that means stepping aside around certain divisions that we've not been able to touch historically.
Shajuti, I know you've thought deeply about how to work as a region to see results on the ground, and also about how to affirmatively further fair housing and break down racial barriers and racial segregation in our communities. I'm just wondering, if you could talk a little bit about how to implement these policies so we actually start to see some results.
Yeah, so I can talk about two regional opportunities right now. One of them is the regional housing needs allocation, which Poncho mentioned. that we've been, so through the Six Wins for Social Equity Network, which is a regional coalition that Public Advocates co-convenes and then Monument Impact and Sacred Heart are members of, we've been advocating around this regional housing planning process over the last couple of years, building off of decades of advocacy that impacted residents have been leading. To make sure that this regional plan is setting up our region so that it can be a place where everyone can thrive. Fortunately, as a result of our advocacy, we're seeing that the current regional housing needs allocation, or the upcoming one, is really set up to reimagine the suburbs because it's requiring more affordable housing in the suburbs than it ever has before. And so that's a really promising outcome, and we're excited to see how that moves forward. And just for anyone who's not familiar with that process, basically it's a regional plan that's required by the state, but it tells, and it gives housing targets to our cities and counties, telling them, how much housing and affordable housing that they should be making room for. And that could be through rezoning, changing permitting policies, or other means. And then cities and counties have to create a local plan where they will commit to making room for this new housing. So that's one avenue at the regional level that can help lead to results on the ground. Another is a new agency called the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, which launched last year. That is going to be providing regional infrastructure and resources to address our housing affordability crisis over the long term. And that'll be a really great chance for advocates and governments to help shape systemic solutions at the regional scale, instead of having fragmented solutions at all 109 different cities and counties. So as the housing element process unfolds at the local levels, the Six Wins for Social Equity Network, other tenant organizers, and affordable housing partners will all be monitoring, advocating across the region to make sure that these local plans are truly rethinking the suburbs by actively undoing racial segregation and its harmful effects.
Debra, and that was great, Shajuti. I appreciate that. A lot of really interesting work that's happening right now in the Bay Area, and that's been developing over the last couple of years, and some significant new state resources to address homelessness and affordable housing, and some appetite amongst the federal government to put some serious money on the table too. So that will be interesting to play out. Supervisor Mar had mentioned, that suburbs are not monolithically white or affluent, and in fact, we have been seeing suburbs become increasingly diverse as folks who are displaced from city centers, just like Debra, who was moving from San Francisco to Concord, certainly talked to a number of people who've made that same move. Debra, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, about what kinds of policies need to be put in place to ensure that as we allow for more development in suburbs, that it's happening in a way that's not displacing existing low-income residents and isn't furthering gentrification or displacement or pushing people even further away. And I know you've done a lot of work in that sphere. So,
yeah, well, I think for some suburbs, and I think Contra Costa suburbs are a good example, you have to name the problem to begin with. And you have to really talk about this pattern of racial injustice that has occurred for decades and decades. And like Poncho said, redlining. We've seen that the majority of new developments in Concord have been market rate, or what is called luxury apartments in the downtown area, because there is a desire by city officials to gentrify the downtown area. Unfortunately, the Monument Corridor is on the edge of the downtown area. And those are the residents that are increasingly under pressure right now. And I'll give you an example. The city wanted to apply for a Prop 68 grant to renovate Ellis Lake Park. And they asked us and another CBO to do community engagement for it. So at the very beginning, from the get-go, we said, we will do this, but the city has to start talking about anti-displacement policies. We have to be very clear about it, because that's what's happened the last time any parks were renovated in the Monument Corridor. And when it came down to completing that process, and we asked for an anti-displacement task force. It was voted down unanimously. This is the problem in suburbs, is not wanting to call displacement displacement. We still have a council member who thinks there's no housing issues in her district, and yet her district, short of the Monument, is probably the second most dense district in the city. We have to begin to look at those RHNA goals and take them seriously. I mean, Concord hasn't come anywhere close to meeting its current RHNA assessment. They have permitted, that doesn't mean built, but permitted 1.4% of their affordable housing goals. There needs to be this spotlight of how, really in any way possible, and of course we do it through organizing and advocacy, so I couldn't agree more with Poncho that we need to have this groundswell of action that is going to start calling it what it is and insisting that there be change to this process. So I know that the Concord's going to be looking at its housing element this summer, and it's a good place to start calling it as this is the city's opportunity to really change the system and break down the barriers to affordable, safe housing that low-income people can also live in. Because I have been at a city council member where a white homeowner said, "Why do we need poor people in Concord?" And that is a direct quote. So when I say this, the backlash even against the North Concord TOD development by homeowners on one edge of it is just an example of what we're facing and why we do have to change the political landscape.
You also worked a lot on trying to increase tenant protections for folks in Concord and Contra Costa County writ large. How's that work been going, and what are some of the challenges you're still facing?
We were successful at the beginning of the pandemic to get eviction moratoriums passed in Concord, Antioch, Pittsburgh, San Pablo, and at the county level, working with our partner organizations. And the thing is, it's always piecemeal, everything around tenant protections, even around the state's response to the this eviction crisis and the rent debt that has piled up for people has been very piecemeal. And who bears the brunt of that piecemeal approach are tenants. So we have, for 5 years, we've been organizing for rent control and just cause in Concord. We have not won either of those. We've gotten relocation assistance, but it follows the state's AB 1482, which leaves out a whole lot of renters out of that process. But we're continuing. We're coming back at City Council with an anti-harassment ordinance or tenant protection ordinance. We're going to keep going because tenants are really on a precipice right now. We are seeing probably a 80% uptick in landlord harassment, and the fact that many tenants are actually just self-evicting to get away from it. And I should say that no one in East County, there's no jurisdiction in East Contra Costa or Central Contra Costa that has any tenant protections.
How do you see that playing a role in thinking about infill development? You talked about anti-displacement measures. Tenant protections are sort of a form of that, but don't necessarily help if a landlord decides to sell the building, right? So,
right. So
what kinds of protections would you like to see implemented with redevelopment?
I mean, we kind of look at housing from that 3 Ps perspective, which is protections, preservation, and production. We are advocating and have been advocating for years for using public land in Concord for affordable housing. So it's not just the Concord Naval Weapons Station, which has been used as the pipeline. We don't really need to build more affordable housing because there will be 25% affordable housing on the Naval Weapons Station, but we know that we don't even have a master developer for it at this point in time. The fact is, we had a tenant, Manuel, who on April 30th was evicted from an apartment. The landlord had actually sort of a townhouse. The landlord tried multiple ways of evicting him earlier, like last fall. None of them stuck. And so he landed on an Ellis Act eviction and pulled the unit from the market. This is a family of 6, a newborn baby, another child with epilepsy, and they were evicted at the end of April, and they still had not found a place to live. So through one of our member organizations, they have paid for an Airbnb for a couple weeks. Monument Impact will be covering their first and last month's rent when they can finally move into a place. But there isn't enough affordable housing. So if we are not building, if we are not planning, we are not moving some of the housing further out of the monument corridor, we are going to have this problem is just going to keep regenerating, and we are certainly not going to break down segregation or any of the exclusionary neighborhoods that have existed in Concord. Even though Concord was a blue collar, much like the Sunset District was a blue collar neighborhood, and now we're finding that people, because they can work remotely, are moving into the city, into Concord, because if they do have to go back, there's a BART station here and they have a way of getting back.
Yeah. I guess BART will be our segue into thinking about transit. There's been a lot of attention in recent years focused on development around transit nodes, train stations, major bus lines. And that has really centered development in areas, in low-income communities that are already at risk of displacement. And as we think about suburbs, that may not, and sort of pushes development to more urban areas as well. And so as we think about how to retrofit suburbs, and I'm going to turn to you, Supervisor Melgar, on this one. How do we retrofit transit or retrofit to serve suburban areas, or how do we retrofit suburbs so that they're well served by transit?
Yeah, I think that we start with a regional approach. And Shajuti, even though I hear you that it's a improvement, having these RHNA numbers that for the first time require some of the suburban neighbors that we have to have affordable housing. I'm not happy with them. I'm not nearly happy with them, actually. I think that it's sort of, they kind of exacerbate some of the patterns that we've seen, and, lets a lot of the folks, in Contra Costa County and in Santa Clara County off the hook for their jobs housing imbalance that has been going on forever. And so part of it is transit. I think that, when years ago we started talking about merging MTC and ABAG, the vision was that we were going to have, this merging of what you just said, Erin, the transportation infrastructure to support housing so that folks can get around to their jobs easily and not have to drive. But that hasn't really happened. We still don't have the teeth that I wish we had. So on a regional level, if we could push for investment in transportation infrastructure, and I think that we should be way more ambitious than that. So I sit on the Bay Area Air Quality Management Board, and what we regulate is the sources of pollution from refineries or whatever. We don't touch carbon, but why shouldn't we? I mean, I think that sort of being ambitious for capturing the externalities of our racially segregated and earth-killing development patterns is what we need to do, and we also need to tax the assets of folks folks who have benefited from the unequal system and invest in a future that's more equal. And so, I think that, I'm a homeowner here in this suburban area, which is wonderful. I did nothing really to earn the huge valuation that my house has earned. And I think that, that is one of the essential inequities. It's economic, it's racial, but it's also having an impact on our earth. And to address it, we need the regional tools, and we also need practical tools. So I think we need financing, we need to increase the development capacity of our nonprofit developers, we need stronger rent control protections, we need to support the work of folks who are doing alternative financing to, immigrants, to folks who are not banked. And I mean, all of those things go together, but I am interested in putting forward like practical tools because we do talk a lot about like sort of the macro, but then, the housing imbalance and the problem is complicated and multifaceted, and there's not only one problem and there's not only one solution. And so all of these things I think need to go together, and we need to support our community organizations in building out the full spectrum of development, of ownership, of tenant protections, of all those other things that we need to do to have a healthy infrastructure and healthy development in our cities.
Your comments generated another, thought for me, which was thinking about sort of variation of density within cities. And San Francisco is kind of a good example of that, where you have neighborhoods that are very dense and have seen lots of development and tons of development pressure, and neighborhoods that have essentially been untouched in decades. And so Supervisor Mar, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ability, one commenter said it to me on Twitter as the obligation to develop in parts of the city that haven't seen as much development. And how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's important to think, to think about who the development is serving, right, and who it's for. Because I think just development, in my district or on the west side of San Francisco, just for the sake of development or increasing housing production, that's a very simplistic perspective. And I know it's being pushed by a lot of people. And I do support, more development in my district. And I know Supervisor Melgar does as well, but it's very important to, for us to think about who the development is serving, and not have it just be what we've seen over the last 10 years in San Francisco, especially development that's exclusively driven by, the developers, right? And their profit, and they're catering to the high end. That's why I described that the latest project in my district, that's renting for $4,000 to $5,500 a month. So that, and I think, proposals that are just sort of simplistic upzoning, even if it is on transit corridors, are really not going to be addressing the real housing, the challenges that we're trying to address right now: housing affordability, segregation, and displacement. And in fact, it's going to worsen it. And we've seen that play out in San Francisco, in the Mission and South of Market, and now Bayview, Hunters Point, and those neighborhoods. And I could see that just happening, or we see it happening right now in the Sunset District, where the working class or even middle class immigrant families, that have been the heart and soul of my neighborhood, forever, can't afford, to live here. The kids growing up in the neighborhood can't afford to live in their neighborhood. So, so I think we need to emphasize affordability and not just simplistic notions of development.
You've raised some really good points, and I want to pose this question to both Supervisors Melgar and Mar. How it does seem like there is a tension between allowing for more development, but also trying to ensure that what gets built is actually affordable to the people who are going to live there. And when we think about public subsidizing of affordable housing, there's a lot of scarce resources. And so when you go to a really high cost area, like the parts of San Francisco that you represent, where you have these $1 million+ homes, it becomes a really hard sell to affordable housing providers to build in those areas because the land cost is so high. So how do you balance those tensions, and what can we do to ensure that affordable housing is built in neighborhoods that haven't seen as much affordable housing, so that it is affordable to those working class neighbors that you were talking about? And I'll start with you, Supervisor Marr.
Well, I would say I don't think land costs are very much or even any higher in our neighborhoods than they are, in the Mission or South of Market, where most of the affordable housing actually has been built, over the last decade. And it's just been a question of, priorities. And I know, for myself and Supervisor Melgar, it's a very high priority, as well as our other West Side colleague, Connie Chan, who represents District 1 in the Richmond. So we're really starting to see a lot more affordable housing development on the West Side. We've also been working with community organizations, nonprofit housing developers, and also other community organizations on the West Side to start building more infrastructure, community infrastructure on the West Side to support affordable housing and to support the development of affordable housing. And it's starting to pay off. In 2019 in San Francisco, voters passed Proposition A, the affordable housing bond, the largest in our city's history. And the first two projects that were funded through the affordable housing bond in 2019 are an affordable family housing project in my district on Irving and 26th Avenue, and then an affordable senior housing project in District 1, Supervisor Chan's district, on Geary and 6th Avenue. And then there's significant new projects in the pipeline in Supervisor Melgar's district, because you have larger, you have more developable sites, right?
Great.
I think that's a really important point. I will agree with Supervisor Marr that land costs are actually not the main impediment. I think the thing that I am often frustrated by is, as Fernando and Peter often hear me talk about, is that we do things a certain way. And, for the investment of the Mayor's Office of Housing into San Francisco's affordable housing stock, the preference is for 50 units or more, large, because that's the sweet spot for the financing. So we working backwards from that's what we build. That's what we're looking for. And in a lot of, the western part of the city, we don't have lots that are that big or zoned for that. So the question is, do we rezone some of the single family homes to permit that, and then folks get all upset about it because we lose that suburban feel? Or do we come up with different tools, different ways to finance affordable housing? And that we haven't really done. And so I do want to talk about money, because I think that, often when we talk about patterns of racial segregation in the suburbs, we think about, the role of zoning for single family and how that led to, but we hardly ever talk about money. And it was a combination of both of those things, right? There was the density controls, but it was also that FHA and, who we chose to, lend money to and mortgages. And I will say that we're still there today, and it's still really difficult, for people of color, for immigrants, for women to get, a mortgage from the bank. And our public sources also are very conservative in terms of what they will finance, and that rethinking part that you're talking about. How do we rethink how we use the land, who goes on it, what we build, how it gets, what are the compliance requirements, where is it? So we've done a little bit of progress in building around, transportation oriented development and stuff, but we're not nearly there in terms of solving the issue of taxing things appropriately, of channeling funding that we need for rent protections, for home ownership, for affordable rental housing, for senior housing, for supportive housing, all of the different needs that we have. We just have a couple tools, and we need dozens and dozens.
Poncho, I want to turn to you. You know, San Jose is considering a policy to allow fourplexes in most of its residential neighborhoods throughout the city where only single family homes had been allowed before. And as the city, you know, it's far from being approved, and I don't even think the city council has even voted to begin studying it, but it has sort of emerged from a committee within the city. You know, as the city embarks upon that process, what are the strategies you want to see employed to ensure that what gets built is actually accessible to low and working class folks in San Jose?
Well, it's a really good point, Erin, and I'm just going to comment a little bit about the fight for that, because I think it's related to what needs to happen to make sure that they are accessible. Because you see, like a lot of suburban environments, like I think in San Jose, for example, about 96% of the city is zoned for single family. Single family zoning is pretty much covers 96% of the residential zoning footprint of the city. And that needs to change, obviously. And while there have been efforts to say, let's look at transit-oriented development, that's where we want to cluster, you know, densification and other things. It's a giant problem if we don't have the ability to actually look at the entire land footprint of the city and how we zone folks and what's incentivized for these different things. And it really requires, again, that idea of political leadership to actually go into and talk about, hey, this is the nature of our community. This is how we want to be able to make sure that our children, the people that are part of the fabric of our community and our life are able to be able to live here, and not just we are the privileged few, and kind of having that difficult conversation around it. And I think that same conversation needs to apply, but it's been caught up in the nature of the kind of the racialized political infrastructure of our community. And so just last fall, there were political leaders, including those that are on the council, saying, who ran on the very idea of you're going to destroy our neighborhoods, our single family beautiful neighborhoods, by actually putting high density housing, which it is not, actually having, you know, the ability to put duplexes and fourplexes, and then you have literally this is a political mailer for attacking one of the candidates who was unsuccessful in large part because of these kind of attacks that were led by our business lobby, and of which the Silicon Valley organization, the Chamber of Commerce for the region, was actually funding this. And it works. It works to scare people. It works to be able to say that you're going to lose your way of life by doing this, even though there was no honesty among this. And so there was a lot of it required a pushback. And so to get more specific to your question, how do you make sure that this is going to be, that the housing is really going to be accessible to the people in our community? First, we need to be able to make sure that we are creating an awareness of the interdependence that we have as a community for everyone here, that everyone's part of the fabric of our community. I mean, we continue to have these conversations without having the real conversation. So recently, one of our school districts was even contemplating the idea of turning some of their surplus land, because they were going to build a new high school and they're going to turn some of the land into some housing. Basically, folks in South San Jose saying, we don't want to build teacher housing. We shouldn't have them in our neighborhood because it's far away from service. They don't want the people that teach their own kids to live in their neighborhood. And in that dialogue, instead of political leaders actually confronting the fact that, are you crazy? This is you're othering people that are part of that are actually with our children every day. And they're talking about property values, and they're talking about, oh, it's not close enough to the amenities that they need or whatever. We weren't even talking about anyone that has any special unique needs, and those can be satisfied anywhere in our community. And it just becomes this debate over who are we, without having a real conversation about why are we othering people in our community, in our society. And I think the real way of actually centering that is, I think, from our perspective, going right at the conversation. Who and why are you afraid of having folks that may not look like you living in your neighborhood? And why are you afraid? And that requires political courage, and it requires people standing up. So what we did in the context of this particular mailer, there was a coalition of about 80 organizations that actually signed on to something decrying the racist practices of, of the business lobby that actually had promoted this. And it wasn't just the business lobby, but it was also the California Association of Realtors and the California Apartment Association that funded these things, putting in there were millions put into a couple of different council races. We lost one, but there was a new candidate that was able to actually win and actually push for that. And ultimately, the Silicon Valley organization disbanded their PAC, and their CEO resigned. And we've been pushing hard to make sure that there's a different kind of political discourse, an honest one, about who is in power and what is the nature of responsibility they have to actually communicate honestly with residents and neighbors about how we approach this work and who is included in our society. We need to have more of those honest conversations, but also let's not be naive here. That we also need to be supporting candidates like candidates and folks that are willing to stick their neck out. That means like money, boots on the ground in terms of organizing and making sure that they have the support that they need, and that we're able to take things even further and say it's not just about what housing we're building for them, but like Debra was talking about, those tenant protections that we need are absolutely essential to making sure that people are able to stay in our community. I'm still shocked by the fact that it's not just in the housing that we need to build, but during COVID, it seems like elected officials are saying, oh, we can do some things around some tenant protections, eviction moratorium, and other things in the context of a crisis that people recognize as COVID. But we've been living in a crisis for a generation. This housing crisis has been something as devastating as COVID has been for our communities, because people are struggling to survive, and we need to be able to bring that level of urgency and maintain it, because the devastation we're going to see in the next few months when these moratoria are lifted are going to be something that we've never experienced before.
On that sobering note, I want to open it up to audience questions. If you haven't thrown a question into the chat, please do so. But Jonah asks about the impact of the pandemic and how we think about suburbs and cities. And so I'm just curious, we have seen a real drop in rents in San Francisco. Those are starting to rise again, of course. But we might see a permanent shift of this work from home, or at least a work from home hybrid. And I'm just wondering, how do you all see this new Zoom life impacting how we think about our cities and our suburbs? And I'll start with the San Francisco folks. Whoever wants to start. How about Supervisor Mar? How do you think this pandemic is going to impact how we think about cities and the sort of traditional city-suburb dichotomy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good chance that the work from home and sort of will really continue in a significant way in San Francisco and in the region, and I think that has a lot of implications on our planning, around housing and jobs and just planning for the region. And then even I think in San Francisco, and say like my district, where it's like there's been some positive aspect of having more people in the neighborhood, work in over the last year plus, in even though with the health restrictions, there's a stronger sense of community, I think, and so I think there's also an opportunity to kind of to plan for that and strengthen our neighborhoods, if there's, especially suburban communities and suburban neighborhoods, if there's going to be more people working, in the neighborhood versus just commuting to work. I think, yeah, there's some interesting opportunities to plan for that and and that to become become another positive element for our neighborhood planning. And one thing that we've been doing in my district is during the pandemic, we actually kicked off a comprehensive neighborhood planning process, community-based planning process called Sunset Forward, where we've been engaging, with the residents and businesses and organizations in the neighborhood around planning for our future, around housing needs, transportation and mobility, and also services and neighborhood businesses. So so I think a lot of the changes, that have been in how we work and where we work, during COVID has become a part of our Sunset Forward planning process.
Hmm.
Okay, Erin, I will be the contrarian that, I have seen any number of articles in the New York Times about how San Francisco's over, how all the tech workers are moving out to Nevada or whatever. I think that's all BS. I think San Francisco has had a pattern of boom and bust forever, since like 1849, when they discovered gold and people started making money. And so I think that, the tech stuff is like our latest hustle. The COVID has, made, the rents go down a little bit in some areas, not all. In my district, which is 2/3 homeowner occupied, real estate values have actually gone up. So I think, that while we are trying to recover, I think in the long term, I don't think it's going to make a difference. I think our housing prices, this is no solution to our housing. I don't think there's any getting out of it. I think we still need to do all of the things that we've been talking about on this Zoom for the last hour: increase affordable housing, protect vulnerable tenants, address the externalities in the right way. And like Supervisor Mar, we also have been doing some planning. I will say that there is, even though my district is not on the whole as working class as District 4, there are pockets of it. And I think that, for the next generation, I ran because there's nothing I want more than my kids to be able to live here. And I don't see how that's going to happen. And increasingly, these single family homes have, 4 bedrooms and 1 senior living in it. And for them, there's no choice because there's no place for them to go. They, giving up their tax base and all that to go where. And so we do need to have more tools for people to be able to age in place, for new generations to be able to live here. And the thing about the suburbs, in terms of the rethinking it, is that there are parts of the suburbs that are great, right? We have really great open space. So we have usually better schools. And why shouldn't that be available to everyone, And so I think that in part of how we're thinking about it, we have to think about race and class and money, and we also in asset building, and we also have to think about generations. How do people age in place and have a place to go, and also how do younger families have access to schools and also be able to live here.
Shajuti, I wanted to riff off of what Supervisor Melgar just said there, and some things that you had talked about earlier in the conversation about, trying to really see an increase of housing and infill development in suburbs, and trying to get more affordable housing into cities that have been resistant to them in the past, and resistant to affordable housing in the past. And I'm just wondering, how do we support people if we are building affordable housing in suburbs to ensure that they are accessing, being able to access services and really get supported to live in suburbs? And Debra, I'll probably ask that same question of you too as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to agree with Supervisor Melgar, the pandemic has actually emphasized the need for us to rethink our suburbs, as we've seen the Bay Area home purchase prices skyrocket, especially in the suburbs. That's really concerning. So the affordability piece is ever more important. And then on trying to make sure that if there's affordable housing built in the suburbs, how can tenants who live there actually benefit from living there? That goes back to the two-part solution I was talking about earlier, where we need, one, to invest in resources that low-income communities of color need, working class families need, while also increasing affordable housing options. So that means like making sure that there are adequately funded public schools in those neighborhoods that those families can attend or send their kids to, not putting the expensive restaurants that are only going to drive up the rents for themselves, like being attuned to what the communities who we're trying to make sure can live there can actually benefit from those resources. So what are the resources they need, not the resources that we want to make it look all shiny and new, but the ones that are actually going to help them thrive and age in place and, work out of poverty. Like if there are public schools that are adequately funded, then kids who are growing up in poverty can at least, have an opportunity to grow and learn and have the support system that they need. So I think it just goes back to making sure that we're always keeping both of those solutions in mind.
Thank you, Shajuti. And Debra, I know this is sort of what you do, so.
Yeah, so, the pandemic simply exposed the housing crisis for what it was, which has to do with the lack of racial justice and the segregation and poverty. We haven't even talked about suburban poverty, which is really significant in East Contra Costa. It's significant in the Monument Corridor. So the schools in the Monument Corridor are not great. They're very under-resourced. And now during the pandemic, you have those children who are not necessarily, they don't speak English at home. They lack, access to quality broadband. They have parents who are not computer literate, who we've had to actually train so they could help their children be able to access their online learning. And so you're going to have a generation of children that are falling behind, that would have been behind anyway had they been in school. Now they're going to be falling behind even more. Frankly, the community that we serve, regardless of whether they're in Concord or Antioch or Brentwood, they don't have the luxury to work remotely. If they're going to have a job, there are essential workers. They have to get out of the house. So there has to be either adequate childcare or schools have to be in session, because what we've seen is now we see a generation of women who have been out of the workforce. And these weren't that great jobs to begin with, but the community is desperate to earn a living, pay their rent, and put food on the table. So I think that the pandemic, what I'm worried about is that once the economy starts to rebound, that things will go back to the way they were. Well, they weren't good enough then, and they're going to be even worse now. So I have to say that rents did not decline during the pandemic. They have gone up. So in Concord anyway. So that is also something. House values are also going up. So what was a $450,000 house, which probably seems like a real steal if you're living in San Francisco, is now a $650,000, $700,000 house. And we're not talking, I mean, these are small houses. So we have to kind of address the speculation. We have to, someone put in a comment about we should tax speculation. I couldn't agree more. We need to do the planning that Supervisor Marr talked about, where we really are balancing our neighbors. It's not just development for development's sake. We can't just gentrify the downtown area in Concord and think it is not going to displace residents on the other side of Clayton Road. And so those tools that we all know we need. That's why we are part of Six Winds, why we're advocating for the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, that our city officials have, in fact, I spoke to the city manager yesterday, market rate housing, according to her, is far cheaper to build than affordable housing. And why she's not giving me the actual economic breakdown of that, this has been the prevailing narrative in the suburbs. If you pass tenant protections, landlords will leave. They'll leave, they'll get out of the business altogether. More people will be unhoused. And you see the power of, Poncho mentioned in this mailer, the power of CAR and CAA in terms of whose campaigns they're supporting. You see that big time in Contra Costa. They reign supreme. So, at the point in which a landlord is going to go out of business, my attitude is, fine, sell your apartment building to someone who actually will use it for the common good. So I don't know if that completely answered your question. I was like trying to piece some of these together.
No,
Yeah,
that was great. I appreciate that. Several people asked about transportation and transit infrastructure, and Poncho and Debra, you both work in communities that are served by transit but have gaps in the service networks. I'm wondering if you could speak to how you envision whether it's development preceding transit, or transit maybe needing to get that transit investment first in order to spur development. I'm interested to get your thoughts about the best way you think that we can get the transit that we need in order to see the development and the affordable housing that we want to see.
I think when I think of transit, I think in a kind of a decentralized, lower density, suburbanized kind of development footprint, like the South Bay. I think we have to get over the idea that that transit is here to actually maximize fare box return for some of these communities. We have to look at transportation as being a part of our infrastructure, and we need to be able to make sure that we're targeting, especially bus transportation, that is really accessible to the communities that we actually serve. So the people that are transit dependent in our communities are those that are low income, extremely low income. There are folks that rely upon them to actually get to work, and it is not a choice or a option to be able to save the, to actually preserve the environment. It's actually about their means of survival. And I think being able to think about that, we need that infrastructure in place for our economy, for people's lives, for children to get to school, to be able to understand that. And that kind of priority needs to be there. So the idea of we are going to build the transit first and do densification around these transit corridors and some other types of things are all based on this very central corporatized environment. Like we have people that are commuting long distances in from other parts of the Bay Area coming into Santa Clara County, and let's try to make sure that they have access to BART and other, or Caltrain or other things to get them quickly to their work. When the truth is, who needs transit? It's actually our people. And when it comes time for when we have a hiccup in the economy or other types of things, we're always like, well, let's look at fare box return. These routes are not really producing a lot, because they're not affordable, they're not reliable, they're not happening at the level of frequency they need to do. And so the response is to cut them further. And so our families are actually coming to us, and they're the ones becoming even more reliant upon cars that are oftentimes inefficient. And so it becomes just a race to the bottom. And I think we need to be thinking very differently about both housing as being part of the infrastructure we put in place for a strong economy, affordable housing, most importantly, because that's where we have the biggest gaps, and transportation as well. And looking at things, if we're going to build it in a suburbanized environment, increase densification, other things, we could utilize shuttles and other types of systems to actually get people to where they need to get to, rather than we are going to live in some utopian future where everyone's going to live in high rises that are right next to some kind of rail line. That's just not reality for our community here, and we have to understand that that is an investment in our future.
I think Poncho really put that well. I think there is in Contra Costa this tremendous pattern of suburban sprawl that follows along a 680 corridor and then the Highway 4 corridor. And there is no planning. You know, development gets proposed, city council will approve it, the homes get built, and meanwhile, people still have to go to work. So, you know, what we see, I saw a statistic the other day that in 2018, 67% of folks in East County drove alone in their car. And if anyone has ever seen County Connection, it is not coming from San Francisco, where you could catch a bus anywhere and you didn't have to wait that long for it. It's in my neighborhood, you might have to wait 2 hours for a bus. We actually started a shuttle a few years ago because we were finding that, you know, women who were getting a bus to go to a WIC office would have to wait 2 to 3 hours with their children, maybe in the rain, we don't have a lot of bus shelters, to get back home again. So we started a shuttle. Unfortunately, it was defunded last fall because of the pandemic and the funding for transit. But I agree, the planning for transit has to go hand in hand with the planning for housing. And we are not going to meet any of our climate goals if we don't do that. So
we're getting close to the end of our time. I wanted to do another quick round robin here with closing thoughts. And for that, I'm hoping that you could all think about some ways, and I know you're already thinking about these in your lives and professional careers, but really thinking about how we can support not just anti-displacement measures, but sort of proactively encouraging policies to allow people who have been displaced to move back to the communities they've been displaced from. I'm thinking about right to return. I'm thinking about home ownership programs that prioritize people of color who in the home ownership process. So I don't know, I haven't coined a term for it, but whatever the opposite is of displacement, like replacement, what are your placement strategies for encouraging a more equitable form of development? Who am I going to pick on first? I don't know. Maybe Supervisor Mar, you go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, well, in San Francisco, I did want to say we do have one small, step in that direction, right? And that's the creation of a preference for below market rate housing units for residents that were displaced, from certain neighborhoods like the Fillmore, right? And so that was an important, first step. And then there has been more discussion and some advocacy and organizing around a broader right to return, especially for African-American residents, because they've been the most impacted by the gentrification in our city for the past decades. So right now there hasn't been a real clear sort of policy or proposal put forward around that yet, but I know that's something that would have a lot of political support, and I think it's a matter of figuring out yeah, what the policy, working with the community and supporting the community to figure out what the policy would be. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to go in the opposite way that I introduced you. So Supervisor Melgar, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I am all about being proactive about things. I agree with you, Erin. And I think that there's a bunch of stuff that we could do in finding the common interest. Usually politically we get, like into, okay, well, these folks want development, these folks don't want, and I actually think there's a large swath, at least in San Francisco, of folks who want to stem displacement and also build new housing. And that's where I want to be, where like the stuff that we agree on and we can do, proactively, because I think that we can. I think that, I want to sort of flip the messaging that we use, and that, oh my gosh, limited resources, affordable housing costs so much money. And that the other side of it is how much it costs for us not to do it. And it may be that right now we may not be seeing it, but our kids are going to see it. Actually, within our lifetime, we're going to see it. We're already seeing it. Look at what our summers look like now, like our air quality and the suffering that people have gone through COVID because they're living in overcrowded conditions, and how our entire, system almost fell apart. And so I would say that we need to start capturing those costs and putting them in the political discussion and investing in the things that we want to invest in, being proactive in the things that we can agree on. If it's the fourplexes at the corner with, the ability for folks to return and have, let's do it. I think that, those are the things that I'm interested in putting forward.
I'm glad that you talked about the cost of inaction, because it is something that often doesn't get talked about. I can't remember if it was Debra or Poncho who's next, but I'm just going to turn it to you, Poncho.
Thank you, Erin. I think, I think ultimately we just need to be in a conversation about that cost of inaction, but also be very, very clear about what is the problem that we're here to solve. And if we have an honest conversation that's really about equity and really about racial equity, like that needs to be at the center of our conversations and how we're able to approach these problems. So I appreciated what Supervisor Marr kind of mentioned, and being able to look at who are we prioritizing, who's been most dramatically impacted, and how are we trying to address that? Because I think a lot of the conversation that we've had around housing and developing housing has been this idea, this fantasy that we live in, that if we just build more housing, everyone will thrive, and because the market will correct itself. Well, the market was never tipped in some kind of a magical direction that made it bad in the first place. It was actually racist policies, both and I appreciate not just around redlining, but also around financing, that were organized by government that made it this way. And it's been government inaction, especially over the last couple of decades, that's not been prioritizing tenant protections, that's made it this way, that if we do not have a racially conscious approach to addressing these issues with things such as right to return, looking at tools to make sure if someone is displaced and there's a right to return, what are we doing to subsidize that family that has been displaced in some kind of redevelopment process, and making sure that they can return to a unit that's not like they lived in a 2-bedroom unit before that was rent controlled, and then they're moving out and then they come back to a tiny 1-bedroom kind of unit that's in a higher density thing. And we think we pat ourselves on the back for we created higher density, we solved this, but like some of the supervisors said, they're coming back, they're $5,500 units that aren't really there for them. And so what is the problem we're trying to solve? And I think that's the kind of the parting shot. We need to be focused in on that. What are we trying to correct?
Debra, your thoughts on the opposite of displacement policies?
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of things, and I just wanted to before I say what I was going to say, is to just respond to what Poncho said. affordable housing that's built in Concord, and I'm presuming this is similar in most other communities, tends to be maybe 2, maybe 3 bedrooms, mostly 1 bedrooms. And if you're a family of 4, as I have a staff member living in the affordable housing complex in Concord, she has 2 teenagers now, one's a boy and one's a girl, it's a 2-bedroom apartment. There's no place, we aren't even building family-sized properties, and we have to take that into consideration when we start to plan for this. But I really want to talk about it. Really, the housing goes hand in hand. In order to kind of rehome people, you have to look at racial economic equity, because that's what's going to lift up workers and families. Policy Link and the National Equity Atlas put out a report that said in Contra Costa that there'd be $15 billion in potential increase in economic output per year with racial equity in income. 18 billion would be the contribution of immigrants to the local economy. So if we are not looking at racial economic equity in tandem with the need for affordable housing so that people of all incomes can live and thrive in a community, we're missing the big picture.
Shajuti, take us home.
I'll just add one thing to everything that everyone else said, and that is to think outside the box. Because we really need all of us and all of our friends and family to think outside the box and put pressure on our elected officials to be doing the same. Because, you know, a lot of people will like complain about their commute or say like, oh, my school is so far, or my job is so far, or, you know, I can't find housing here. And then we can respond by saying that, you know, our system doesn't have to be this way. We can ask our elected officials to change that. And so I think once we start being open to changing the systems that we're living in, I think that will help our elected officials actually make those changes too. So I really appreciate Supervisors Mar and Melgar thinking about how to do that. But I would love for everyone in the Bay Area to be thinking outside the box as well.
Thank you. And thank you, Tutu, for inviting me on this panel to help moderate. I feel very honored to be among such esteemed thinkers and really enjoyed all of your comments and perspectives. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone. This was really informative for us as well. And just want to end by saying we've got a few more events coming up this week. So invite you to join us. You can find more information at sfcho.org/events. And thank you again. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Supervisors Melgar and Mar, Debra, Poncho, Shajuti. It's always great to work with you and to see and hear you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
And I am loving the background of affordable housing as infrastructure that Jeff Rigo has. I get one of those.
Bye.